and simply didn't comprehend the sense of left behind and anger that is there in so many people and so many communities as they watch this country become more and more divided. They see more and more representations of real poverty, of food banks, of people sleeping on the streets and people begging all around the country, and so many young people loaded with debt they shouldn't be loaded with, and so many people seeing their real wages falling and their communities being forgotten and left behind. Some former mining communities have seen no investment whatsoever since the end of the coal industry, and it's that sense of anger that's there. But what changed things in the election was, they called it with that arrogance they did, the way that we were written off by just about everybody at the start of the campaign, and the way that the party came together to campaign to win this election. I'm determined that we carry on in that way, and I'm very determined to achieve the best possible result, which will be a Labour government in this country. What also changed things was the manifesto, and I want to pay a huge tribute to those that contributed to and helped to write our manifesto, because the election was called, and anybody who thinks they knew the date coming in advance must have been walking around Doncaster with Theresa May at the time, because apparently I don't think anybody knew it was coming. And in 2 weeks we produced a transformational manifesto, and I pay a huge tribute to Andrew Fisher and all the teams in our Labour Party head office, in my office, union offices, and dozens of community organisations and campaigns that sent us in their ideas and their views, and we put the manifesto together, which was, for the first time I can remember in any general election, people were actually talking about the manifesto and asking for details of it, ideas that were in it. I think that is an amazing achievement for a party to do. And what our campaign also did was to campaign in a very different way. Yes, we do the very, very important work of voter identification, of reminding people to vote on polling day, having ascertained how they're going to vote. But you can't win an election without doing it. What we also did was change the nature of the conversation. And so people were talking about the election and challenging Tory views and challenging the assumption of a continuation of division and poverty in our society, in cafes, in pubs, on trains, on buses, anywhere around the country. And a lot of young people got involved in the campaign for the first time in their lives. Now I want to say a huge thank you to the 2 million people, across the whole country who registered to vote in the period up to the voter registration. That made an enormous difference. But it wasn't just a campaign about young people, it was a campaign of how you get a message across. I understand some of our national daily newspapers are quite hostile to us. And my neighbours tell me that they sometimes write very nasty things about me in the paper. And I have to say, it doesn't bother me because I don't read it. But I just think we have to think about this. They write all this stuff. I will not, and never do, respond to that kind of stuff. And I don't use that kind of language against anybody either. I'm not getting in the gutter with anybody, because I'm more interested in getting our views and ideas across. And so we need to set an example of not using personal abuse to anybody at any time, including particularly on social media. And the campaign was strong because we stuck to the policy, strong because of the way we got the message across. I indicated we'd had some problems with some of our national newspapers, but if you look at the other methods of communication, social media, Facebook, Twitter, and all those different mediums, Snapchat, etc., we got a massive following and a massive take-up on that, because we could bypass those that were trying to interpret or misinterpret what we were actually saying. And I'm very grateful to everyone, every cyber warrior in the country that got on their keyboard late at night to say, well, Labour never said that. Labour was saying something very, very different. And and the way in which the broadcasting rules kicked in during the election itself, which meant there had to be a relative fairness in broadcasting time for all of us. And the surprising decision of the Prime Minister not to engage in debate, I don't think helped the Tory cause at all. And I quite enjoyed going to Cambridge that evening when waiting for her to come, but she didn't turn up. But that's all right. People can travel wherever they wish. The other issues in the campaign were challenging the economic orthodoxy that has been presented too often as being something without alternative. Do we have to live in a country where the richest minority gets permanently richer, where governments hand tax relief out to big businesses and corporations and the very richest on the basis that on a good day they might invest some of that money, and on a very good day they might pay their wages, the wages of their workers a bit more, and there will be a trickle-down effect onto the rest of the society? And do we have to accept that the financial crisis of 2008-9 has got to be paid for by the frozen wages of doctors, nurses, hospital workers, teaching assistants, teachers, firefighters, police officers, and every other person living in the public, working in the public sector? Obviously, it is wrong. And we have now the continuation of falling real wages in Britain. We have a continuation of the lowest levels of investment of any of the major industrial countries, and that is continuing. And we have this somehow rather vague belief that all this is going to work out all right in the end. Well, it won't, and it can't, and we have to change direction and change gear in our society. And that is what this election was about, was challenging the status quo, and the status quo which wallows in inequality at the same time as ignoring poverty and injustice within our society. And we called it out for what it is because it affects everybody in every part of the country. Now, when you're campaigning here in Bournemouth and in Dorset, you might think, well, and it's a very relatively wealthy area, and if you look at the indices across the whole country, yes, there is a great deal of personal disposable wealth held by some people living in this beautiful part of the country and this wonderful area. Thomas Hardy outlined just what rural poverty and injustice was like when he wrote his wonderful works, and he would recognise some of that goes on today. Just because you live in a beautiful place and a beautiful community and you've got lovely coastline and beautiful villages and forests around you, it doesn't make you wealthy automatically. The loss of services, the loss of bus services, the closure of schools, the underfunding of education, the hospital waiting lists affect you just like anybody else, anywhere else in the whole country. And so, when we develop our campaigning, I want you to think about this very seriously. We fought the election on a manifesto which is transformational. Transformational in our economic ideas and all our other ideas. I want that manifesto to be the bedrock of the growth of policy development, and I've asked each of the shadow teams in the shadow cabinet and the others to get together and prepare details of how we would put these ideas into practice and what that policy development would mean. This isn't going to be restricted to members of the shadow cabinet or members of parliament or the national executive. I want it to go much wider, so the whole party's involved, the whole community's involved, because we need the ideas of everybody to make life better for everybody within our society. We can't do it exclusively on our own. Give you an example. Transport. Transport policy is absolutely crucial. We're very clear where we are on the national picture, that we want our rail services in public ownership. After all, we've invested in those services. We've invested in those services, and we want the return on them. And we value and appreciate the huge work done by rail workers in running what is often a very, very complicated system. Investment in rail is uniform across the whole country. Main lines tend to get quite a lot of money, rural lines get very little, and so we need to improve all of that. I mean, if you take, for example, the Bristol to Weymouth line. That could do with a lot of improvement. There's plenty of other lines around the country that could do with a great deal of improvement. The feeder system into the main lines is important. And so, when we're campaigning, do all of that, but also bring people together to discuss what they would do to improve rail services. But the next step up is one that gets very little public debate, and that is bus services. Nationally, about 1.5 billion rail journeys are made per year. There's 3 times that number of bus journeys made over the whole of the UK per year. But because I suspect very few national commentators on anything or everything ever travel on a bus, they don't even think about that. And so we have a largely deregulated bus service across the whole country. It's very sporadic. Only in London is it fully regulated, and that was a battle royal we had in the early 1980s to prevent the Tories deregulating the bus services in London. Because we won that battle, we have a much better bus service in London. The rest of the country, by and large, does not. And so that means using the new bus legislation and extending that to give local authorities the power of ownership of bus companies and, crucially, a role in bus regulation. But it's also about extending buses into rural areas or communities that are left behind. Because if you're to deal with the issues of inequality and injustice in rural communities, it has to be done through better transport, better broadband connections, and a preparedness to invest in appropriate small-scale businesses and industrial development. All of that's the kind of thing that cannot be done by a party leadership or a shadow cabinet or a government on its own. It can only be done by people in communities. So we build up this aggregation of interest and support in what we want to achieve in our communities as a whole. We can do the same with the energy generation ideas. We're not proposing to take over any of the big 6. What we're instead proposing to do is promote cooperatively owned and local authority owned and local micro-generation of electricity, which is more environmentally sustainable, brings communities together, and ultimately provides them with cheaper electricity as well. It's more efficient in Germany, it's not more in this country. So those are a couple of ideas that you might care to think about in the discussions and campaigning work that you do, and also the issues of housing and housing injustice. I mentioned at the start of my speech the levels of homelessness that exist around the country. Everyone that's a street sleeper has a different and often very complicated and often very sad story. And they shouldn't be sleeping on the streets, they should be supported, and nobody should be in that situation in the 5th richest country in the world in the 21st century. But in many ways, they're not the cause of the housing crisis, they're the symptoms of a housing crisis. The symptoms of insufficiency of council accommodation being built, too much of it has been sold off, and unregulated private rented sector, which creates levels of insecurity that are wrong and unnecessary in our society. And I would have thought the disaster of Grenfell Tower will at last wake the whole country up to what it is like to live in what turned out to be a dangerous towering inferno in the richest borough in the country. Isn't that an indication of just how bad things have got and how far we've gone away from the idea of the whole community being properly cared for, supported and decently housed? And so, our promise, which is to invest in housing, our promise which is to build enough council housing and to build those houses for sale as well, so that people can buy into the system, buy into a reasonable property if they can afford it through a secure mortgage. Because we have a problem with too much overcrowding, we have a problem of too much insecurity in the private rented sector, and we have a private sector that is unaffordable for a very large number of people, and we have, I think, the highest age for leaving home of any country in Europe. And that affects areas like Bournemouth as well. It is not just one that affects the biggest cities. Again, campaigning issues for you to do as a party within our community and build support for us in that way. Build that sense of community engagement, involvement, and indeed ownership of the policies. Therein lies the road to a general election victory as soon as Theresa May chooses to move on and allow us to have that general election. there were two other features of the election campaign that impressed me a great deal. One was that sense of community that is there within our campaign. We held rallies all over the country, we held meetings all over the country, and there were more election events held by Labour than any time I can ever remember. So many we don't even know where they all were or what they all were. There were just so many of them flowing in, people holding events and street things and so on and so on. It was very much an outdoor popular campaign. Now if we have an election in midwinter, that might be slightly difficult, but I'm very stoic. I don't mind where I go in the rain or the snow, it's fine. Indeed, this election campaign did begin in the snows of Aviemore when I went to speak to the Scottish TUC, and I was very happy to do that. But it is that involvement that's so important, and we look around you. Look around you here today, look at all the meetings. Young, old, black, white, people with disabilities, LGBT, everybody there together. And it's the strength of communities together, which is what we are about as a party. And so we demonstrate by our very being what we are and what we represent. And those that have suffered or continue to suffer insecurity in their lives have to be supported. The issue of social care came forefront in the election campaign. Came forefront, and I'm glad it did, because we have a completely unfair system. If you suffer from cancer, you get support within the NHS, absolutely right, and that's how it must always be. If, however, you have the misfortune to suffer from dementia, it isn't necessarily seen as a medical condition, it's seen as a social care condition. So under the Tory plans, you would lose part or all of your house, depending where you were in the whole country, and your family would probably have to support you, or often give up work in order to support them. If you can't hear, I'll shout louder. Okay. And the Tory proposal was simply incoherent and incomplete. There are already 1 million people waiting for the social care that is not being provided, and that number is likely to grow. The only way forward has to be an acceptance that we as a community must be prepared to support people who need social care in exactly the same way we as a community support children in education or those with a medical health condition that need support within our NHS. We have to move on to the idea of comprehensive support. Not simple, not cheap, I fully understand all of that. But if we're to live in a decent, civilised society, we've got to move on into that direction. And that, again, was the view we put forward in the election of a National Care Service. And I invite you to submit your ideas, your views, and your opinions as to how that might be developed. Because everyone should have security in their lives. The future, obviously, is our children, the future, the young people in our society. There's something very wrong and very sad about this country. You look at the postcode where a baby is born, you look at the provision of preschool, nursery, playgroup sort of facilities they get, and you can almost map out what's likely to happen in the rest of their lives from that. That is simply wrong. That's why I am very determined that we will invest in preschool facilities so that all children will get at least 30 hours per week free preschool facilities together, so they become united as children very young, understand each other. Those crucial early years of understanding social interaction with other children is so important. And that we will end the funding crisis in our primary schools, where head teachers being told to raise funds from the parents if they can afford it. I've heard of a school near here that's considering closing one afternoon a week because they can't afford to stay open for the whole 5 days. I've heard of schools changing the length of the school day, and I constantly hear of children in schools where you ask who the head teacher is and they can't remember because they've been changed so often, or their class teacher that changes almost every term. That is destabilising and unsettling for the children, and obviously damages their educational opportunities. So it is a vital necessity we fund all our schools, every part of the country, fairly and properly. And lift the public sector pay cap for teachers and teaching assistants. But I also very proud of one bit of our manifesto, not a particularly expensive part of the manifesto, which recognises, hello, yes, I'll give you another wave, all right, thank you. Is about the creativity and ambition of children. Hi, yes. Sorry to turn my back on you. I didn't mean to. It is about the creativity and artistic creativity in children. Because if you look at children's art, it's often very instructive about their thought process, very instructive about their lives, and also about their imagination. And I was looking at one children's art exhibition in a primary school in my constituency yesterday. Very impressive, very interesting what their views were of places and things, and then asking the children to describe it to you without any inhibitions. I don't want inhibitions of people writing poetry, or painting, or music, or anything else. And so we're proposing a pupil arts premium for the whole of the UK, which will mean that every child in every school will get to learn a musical instrument whilst they're in school. And there's another primary school I was at yesterday in my constituency. It is a primary school of predominantly low-income families. It's one of the poorest schools in my borough. They have managed, because they're very good at managing things, to ensure that every child gets to learn music while they're in school. And they told me that maths and English have improved as a result of that. So it's not just creativity, also there's a hard educational argument for it as well, which I'm putting forward, and indeed we will continue to do that. But it's later on in the education career of young people that we've got to think very hard. Those that go to college now have to pay fees. Those that go to university pay increasing fees. Those that are thinking of applying to university are made nervous by the costs of it, and sadly, far too many drop out because they're too much in debt. I absolutely agree, thank you. At least I think I do. Is about university and higher education funding. Because if we continue to load generation after generation with university debts, where parents take out mortgages to try and support their children through university, meaning that they themselves have loaded the debt somewhere else. As a society, it's simply not sustainable. As a method of encouraging young people to develop themselves to their fullest potential, it's simply short-sighted and not sensible at all. Because if a young person wants to achieve, is determined to become an engineer, a plumber, an electrician, determined to become a teacher or a nurse or a doctor, all of which we need in our society. Any society needs all of those. And they don't do it because they couldn't afford it at the time, because the EMA had gone, because the fees had come in, because the university tuition fees had come in. And they either start the course and drop out, or don't even start the course at all. We all lose, they lose as well. It is an incredibly short-sighted view of education that you load it all onto the individual to pay for it post-school. And so we discussed this at great length, and it is expensive. I fully understand it's expensive, but we took the view, I'm very proud that we took the view, that it is right to raise corporate levels of taxation a bit, not even to the level they were in 2010, but raise it enough that we can pay for this, and raise it enough that we can pay for this proposal. And it will be there in the next manifesto, in the next election, and I want to be the head of that Labour government that introduces that policy. It is about the future of all of us within our society. In this election, we challenged the idea that austerity works. We challenged the idea that you cut your way to prosperity. We challenged the idea of the underfunding of public services. But we were also positive in what we do for the future, through investment in infrastructure, investment in jobs, investment in high-tech industries, investment in sustainable, both environmentally and economically sustainable work in the future, because that has to be the right way forward for our society and this country. And that's why we made such a lot of that within the general election. Again, those policies are now open to debate and discussion within the party, so we develop them into the details necessary. I was in Brussels on Thursday saying that we were utterly determined to maintain a tariff-free access to European markets, that we would absolutely guarantee the rights of all EU citizens to remain in this country with rights of family reunion, and we want the same for British nationals in the future, and we wanted a partnership with the EU in the future. None of this is simple, but we have to go forward and take these views forward of the kind of society we want to create and the kind of relationships we want with the rest of the world, where we have an international foreign policy that's based on human rights, on justice, democracy and environmental sustainability. Ours will be a government that would be quite prepared to be very blunt with President Donald Trump. Don't walk away from the Paris climate change accord and stand up for the environmental needs of the whole planet. If we don't do that, what are we leaving for future generations? And so, running as a core and a thread through all our policies are respect for the individual, our respect for human rights, and our respect for how we improve the life chances of everyone in our society. That means tough anti-discrimination legislation, proper funding of the Equalities Commission. It means challenging the gender pay gap. It means challenging the way in which people with disabilities, half of whom live in poverty or households in poverty because of discrimination on them. And it means proper funding of mental health services just as much as we fund physical health services within our society. It's these kind of principles that we're putting forward. So we have a challenge ahead of us. The challenge is to confront this government in Parliament, as we're doing, on the issues of public sector pay. For example, 3 days after the Queen's speech announced, we put down an amendment to it, quite simply saying that the public sector pay cap should be lifted and proper negotiations should take place, pointing out that NHS workers have had in effect a 14% pay cut in the past 7 years. Not a complicated concept at all. The DUP, having flushed themselves with £1 billion to go into Northern Ireland. I don't regret anyone getting money and investment in Northern Ireland. I just think it should go for the whole of the UK as well. And they voted with the Tories on that, thus saying to public sector workers in Northern Ireland, just as much as public sector workers in Bournemouth or in Newcastle, you're not worthy of it, we're not going to pay you anymore. Well, they voted the way they did, we voted the way that we did. We'll continue challenging on that, just as much as we'll continue challenging on insecure work, 0 hours contract, bogus self-employment, and all the other travesties that happen within the world of employment because of deregulation, because of the Trade Union Act that went through. And I conclude with this. Our party membership has grown from 200,000 in 2015 to 560,000 now. That means party membership brings us all together and gives us this incredible opportunity to take that message out there. And the creativity of ideas that comes from people being together, working together, campaigning together, and giving confidence to communities. That's a government that cuts your library, underfunds your hospital, doesn't pay enough money to run your school, is a government on notice from the people of this country. We want to do things differently, and we will do things differently. That is why people join the Labour Party. That is why the Labour Party was founded in the first place. Tomorrow I'll be at the festival, the Memorial Festival for the Culpable Martyrs, and it's a wonderful occasion, and I'll see probably many of you there. Our history is a history of many, many things. It's also a history of incredible sacrifice and bravery by people standing up against apparently impossible odds. Those 6 farm labourers that stood up to say, hang on, the way we're being treated is wrong. The way we're being underpaid is wrong. The way we're being driven off our land because of common lands enclosure at that time is wrong. We demand the right to be represented together. They ended up imprisoned and transported as a result. They probably thought that was the end of everything. But that injustice by the Assizes Court in Dorchester sparked something that grew very strongly, a mass movement, even in the 19th century, for their release and their return. And a lot of that was achieved. And so the democracy we have comes from the sacrifices of those that went before. The fact we have a Labour Party comes from those that made sacrifices before. They didn't enjoy a national health service or free education. They didn't enjoy any of those kind of securities that we've managed to achieve. We're in the 21st century now. Technology has moved on, opportunities have moved on, and huge opportunities lie ahead. But those basic principles about people, democracy and rights are there for all time, and they're there for all time with us in our common consciousness and our party. So let's be proud of what went before, proud of those that gave us the National Health Service and gave us so much more. And in their memory, we work on. In their memory, we develop a society that genuinely cares for and works for all, that doesn't tolerate inequality, injustice and unnecessary poverty, but instead brings people together in an ambition for a better world and a better society. Can I say thank you very much to Bournemouth for joining me here today?
Thank you.